My son showed up at my door on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and he wasn't alone. I remember standing in the kitchen when I heard the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. Since I'd retired from the post office 18 months earlier, my Tuesdays had become quiet things. A walk along the trail by the river if the weather allowed, maybe a call with my old friend Gord, sometimes just sitting with a coffee and watching the geese gather on the lake behind the house. I liked the quiet. After 34 years of sorting mail at 6 in the morning and managing a crew of 12, the quiet felt like something I'd earned. I opened the door and there he was, my son. Standing behind him, just slightly off to the side, was a man in a gray suit I didn't recognize. "Dad," he said. He was smiling, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You got a minute?" I should tell you a little about myself before I go any further, because none of what happened later makes sense unless you understand where I started. My name is Walter. I'm 67 years old. I live in a small town outside of Kingston, Ontario. The same house my late wife Irene and I bought back in 1991 when we were 32 and thought we had all the time in the world. The house is paid off. Has been for 9 years. It sits on just under an acre, backs onto a small lake, and is worth a fair bit more than what we paid for it. That's not a brag. It's just how things went. We didn't do anything fancy. We just stayed, kept the place up, and let time do the rest. Irene passed away 2.5 years ago. Ovarian cancer. We had 14 months from diagnosis to the end. And I will tell you honestly that those 14 months were the hardest thing I have ever been through. And I say that as a man who buried his own father at 41 and watched his mother spend her last years not recognizing anyone she'd ever loved. After Irene died, I kept going. That's the only way I know how to describe it. I kept going. I retired from Canada Post about 8 months after she passed. The pension is decent, not extravagant, but enough to cover property taxes, groceries, utilities, and still leave a little for the occasional dinner out and the odd weekend trip to visit my sister down in Cobourg. I also had RRSPs and some money in a TFSA that my financial planner, a woman named Sandra, had helped me grow over the years. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable. Genuinely comfortable in a way I was proud of, because Irene and I had been careful with money our whole lives. My son knew most of this. He just seemed to have very different ideas about what it all meant. His name is Kevin. He's 39. He works in sales, something to do with commercial real estate software. And for a long time, he did well enough. His wife, I'll call her my daughter-in-law, because that's what she is. Her name is Amber. Together they have 2 kids, my grandchildren, who I love without question and completely. Here's what I also knew, though we rarely spoke about it directly. Kevin and Amber had money trouble. I'd pieced it together over the years, the way you piece things together when your child won't talk to you, but you're paying attention anyway. There was the period 3 or 4 years back when they suddenly stopped mentioning the cottage they'd been renting every August. There was the way Kevin always deflected when the topic of his kids' registered education savings came up. There was the vacation that got postponed twice and then quietly never mentioned again. Small things individually. Together they told a story. I'd offered to help a few times, not with large sums. I wasn't in a position to hand over tens of thousands of dollars. And even if I had been, I wasn't sure it would have helped. When I'd suggested contributing to the kids' RSPs, Kevin brushed it off. "We're fine, Dad," he'd said, in a tone that meant he didn't want to talk about it. So I didn't push. I figured he'd come to me when he was ready. I didn't expect him to come to me with a lawyer. The man in the gray suit introduced himself as a financial advisor. He handed me a business card. I looked at it for a moment, then set it down on the hall table. I invited them in because I didn't know what else to do. We sat in the living room. Me in the armchair that had been mine for 20 years, Kevin on the couch. The advisor next to him with a briefcase on his knees. Kevin started by asking how I was managing. "Fine," I said. "Same as always." "The house is a lot to keep up on your own," he said. "It's not that much work," I said. "I know every corner of this place." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not really listening. Then he asked if I'd given any thought to downsizing. I said I hadn't. He asked if I was still handling all my own banking, all my financial decisions. I said I was. He said, carefully, that he and Amber had been thinking that at my age, with the house and the investments and everything, it might be worth having someone help me manage things more formally, make sure everything was protected, make sure there was a clear plan. I looked at him. Then I looked at the man in the suit. What kind of plan? I asked. Kevin reached into the briefcase and took out a folder. He set it on the coffee table between us and pushed it toward me. We've had some documents prepared, he said. It's just a power of attorney arrangement, financial and property. So that if anything ever happened to you, if you got sick or confused or just needed help, we'd be able to step in and make sure things were handled properly. I didn't touch the folder. Who prepared these? I asked. He glanced at the man beside him. Gerald here has worked with a lot of families in situations like yours. Situations like mine, I repeated. Widowers, he said. Retired. Living alone. It's more common than you think, Dad. It's just practical planning. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, the light was going golden the way it does in October in eastern Ontario. That particular low afternoon light that makes everything look a little like a painting. I could hear the geese on the lake. How much debt are you carrying right now? I asked. Kevin's jaw tightened. That's not what this is about. I'm just asking. This is about your well-being, Dad. I appreciate that, I said. I do, but I want to understand the context. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, we're behind on the mortgage. Amber's car needs work. The kids' activities are expensive. We're not asking you for money. We're just asking you to give us the ability to help you if you need it. I nodded slowly. I'd like to think about it, I said. There's no rush, he said, but the way he said it told me there was. They left about 40 minutes later. I walked them to the door, shook Gerald's hand, watched the car back out of the driveway. Then I went back inside and sat down in my armchair in the quiet house and stared at the folder he'd left on the coffee table. I didn't open it. What I want to say here, and I want to say it carefully, because this is the part that people sometimes don't understand, is that I did not immediately believe my son was a bad person. I still don't. Kevin loves me, I think, in the way that people love their parents when they've never really stopped to separate that love from their own needs. He was in trouble, genuinely in trouble, and he was scared, and he had convinced himself that what he was asking me to do was reasonable. Maybe Gerald had helped him convince himself. Maybe Amber had. Maybe he'd done it all on his own. I don't know. What I know is that I sat in that armchair for a long time after they left, and I thought about Irene. Irene would have known what to do. She always did. She had this clarity about people. Not a harsh clarity. Not the kind that made her cynical, but a clear-eyed, warm, steady sense of what was real. She would have looked at that folder on the coffee table and she would have said quietly, Walter, you need to call Gord. So I called Gord. Gord McPherson has been my best friend since we were both 22 years old and working summer jobs at the same distribution warehouse in Brockville. We've been through a lot together. He was the best man at my wedding. I was at the hospital the night his son was born. We've fished together, argued about hockey, helped each other move furniture, and sat together at more funerals than I care to count. He is one of the most decent men I have ever known. He is also a retired notary public. For 31 years before he retired, he worked in estate planning and property law. I told him everything. The knock at the door, the man in the gray suit, the folder, what Kevin had said. Gord was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Did you sign anything? No, I said. Good, he said. Don't sign anything until I've seen it. I told him I wasn't planning to. He said he'd drive up Thursday. I told him I appreciated it. He said, Walter, stop thanking me. This is what we do. That was the sentence that stayed with me. This is what we do. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks between that Tuesday and the day Kevin came back. I called Sandra, my financial planner. I told her what Kevin had proposed. She was quiet for a moment in the way that financial professionals are quiet when they're choosing their words carefully. And then she said that a power of attorney is a legitimate planning tool, genuinely useful in the right circumstances, but that the circumstances mattered enormously, and that any document of that nature should be reviewed by an independent lawyer before I signed it. Full stop. She also asked, gently, if I was feeling any pressure from family members. I said I wasn't sure yet. She said, let me know if that changes. I also did something else. I went to see my own lawyer, a woman named Diane, who'd handled Irene's estate and had been our family's solicitor for 15 years. I brought the folder Kevin had left. Diane looked through it for about 20 minutes while I sat across from her desk and looked out at the parking lot. When she put it down, she folded her hands on top of it and looked at me. Walter, she said, this document would give your son nearly unlimited authority over your financial assets and real property, including the ability to transfer title on your house without your direct involvement in individual transactions, once a triggering condition is met. What's the triggering condition? I asked. A letter from a single physician stating that you are unable to manage your own affairs, she said. One physician, not a panel, not a court assessment. One letter. I looked at her. Is that standard? I asked. It is not, she said. The standard we'd recommend is 2 independent assessments, or a formal capacity evaluation. This document, as written, is structured in a way that would be very easy to activate and very difficult to challenge once activated. I drove home in the dark. I made myself dinner. I ate it standing up at the kitchen counter because I didn't feel like sitting. That night I called Kevin, and I told him I was going to have a lawyer look at the documents before I made any decisions. He said that was fine. His voice was carefully controlled. Of course, Dad. Take your time. After we hung up, I stood by the window and looked out at the lake. The water was dark and flat, and the last of the October light was gone. I thought about all the years Irene and I had spent in this house, all the evenings on the back deck, all the winters watching the ice form on the lake, all the ordinary, irreplaceable days. I thought, I am not going to lose this house. Gord came up on Thursday as promised and stayed through the weekend. He read the documents thoroughly, made notes, and confirmed everything Diane had said. He also told me something I hadn't known, that in Ontario, a continuing power of attorney for property is a legally powerful instrument that, if misused, can be incredibly difficult to reverse once a person has been deemed incapable or has been pressured into signing while still capable. There are cases, he said, where families use these documents entirely legitimately. But there are also cases where they don't, and the document Kevin gave you is not written with your protection as the priority. I asked him what he thought I should do. He said, what do you want to do? I thought about it. I want to protect the house, I said, and the investments. I want to make sure that if I do get to a point where I can't manage things, there's a fair process. Not one person with a letter from one doctor. Gord nodded. Then let's set that up properly. Over the next 3 weeks, with Gord and Diane both involved, I put together what Diane called a proper estate and capacity plan. This included a new continuing power of attorney for property, one that required 2 independent capacity assessments that named Diane's firm as a third-party oversight body, and that explicitly limited certain transactions, including the sale or transfer of the house, without additional legal process. I also updated my will, which had been sitting unchanged since Irene died. The plan didn't cut Kevin out. He was still named as a beneficiary. His children's as ZESPs, which I'd quietly opened and started contributing to without fanfare, were still in place. But the kind of unilateral authority he'd been asking for, that was gone before it ever existed. I didn't tell Kevin any of this right away. I didn't know exactly when to tell him. I was still working through what I felt about all of it. The grief that sat underneath the anger, the complicated love that doesn't go away just because someone has let you down. He called on a Thursday evening in late November. He asked if I'd had a chance to look at the documents. I said I had. He asked what I thought. I said I had some questions. He asked if he could come by on Saturday. He said I'd like to talk it through. He said Amber might come too, and maybe bring the kids, as if the presence of my grandchildren might soften something, and honestly, it probably would have, in another version of this conversation. I said Saturday was fine. I called Gord after I hung up. Saturday, I said. I'll be there, he said. They arrived at 11 in the morning. The kids ran in ahead of everyone else, the way kids do. My grandson is 8 and my granddaughter is 5. And they went straight for the biscuit tin in the kitchen because they know it's always there for them. I hugged them both and felt that pure, uncomplicated love that grandchildren bring, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you and doesn't come with fine print. Kevin and Amber came in after. Amber looked tense. Kevin was doing the thing he does when he's nervous, talking a little too much about nothing, asking how the drive had been when he'd just driven it himself. They stopped when they saw Gord sitting at the kitchen table. Kevin looked at him, then at me. "What's he doing here?" he said. It wasn't hostile, exactly, but it wasn't warm either. "Gord is my friend," I said. "He's been helping me review some things." Kevin looked at Gord again, the retired notary, the man who'd known me for 45 years, the man who'd spent 31 of those years working in property and estate law. Something shifted in Kevin's expression. I watched it happen. The careful, managed version of his face, the one he'd been wearing since October, gave way for just a moment to something rawer. I recognized it. It was the look of someone realizing that a plan they've been carrying for months has just become much more complicated. "Let's sit down," I said. We sent the kids to the living room with a movie. The four of us sat at the kitchen table, me and Gord on one side, Kevin and Amber on the other. I noticed Amber hadn't brought the folder with a new copy of the documents. That struck me. I told them what I'd done. Not angrily, not as an accusation. I just explained it, step by step, that I'd had Diane review the original documents, that I'd found the terms concerning, that I'd worked with her and with Gord to put a proper plan in place. One that would protect me if my capacity ever declined, but that required appropriate oversight rather than a single gatekeeper with broad authority. Amber interrupted me partway through. "We were just trying to help," she said. "I know," I said, and I meant it. I believe she believed that, at least partly. "Dad," Kevin said, and his voice was tight, "we're your family. We're not strangers trying to take advantage of you." "I know that too," I said. "But Gord is also my family in the way that matters. And Diane has been looking out for me legally for 15 years. When something as significant as a power of attorney comes to me the way this one did, with a stranger, without warning, without any prior conversation, I'd be a fool not to get independent advice. And I'm not a fool, Kevin. I've never been a fool." He was quiet for a moment. "Is this about the mortgage?" he said finally. "Is that what this is about?" "I asked you about the mortgage back in October," I said. "You told me this wasn't about that." He didn't answer. "Here's what I want to say," I said. "I love you. I love those kids in the other room more than I can put into words. If you are struggling, genuinely struggling, I want to know about it. Not through a document, not through a man in a suit sitting on my couch. I want you to talk to me like my son." I stopped for a moment. "Can you do that?" Kevin put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face. Amber put a hand on his back. After a long moment, he said, "We're in over our heads." And just like that, we were finally talking about the real thing. I won't go through all of it. That belongs to Kevin and Amber, not to me to share in detail. What I will tell you is that the situation was serious, but not irretrievable. The mortgage arrears were significant. There were credit card balances. Some decisions had been made over the past few years that compounded on each other in ways they hadn't anticipated. I didn't give them the house. I didn't sign anything. But I did, over the following weeks, sit down with Sandra and work out a way to help that made sense. A structured loan, documented properly, with Diane's office handling the paperwork, that gave Kevin and Amber enough breathing room to stabilize without creating the kind of dependency that helps nobody. It wasn't what they'd originally come looking for. I think Kevin understood even then that what they'd originally come looking for had been the wrong thing to want. I'm not sure Amber has entirely forgiven me for having Gord there that Saturday morning. That's all right. I didn't do it to be forgiven. I did it because a man who has spent his life being careful and intentional has the right to stay that way, even when the people who love him think they know better. There's a thing Gord said to me one evening that winter, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching the snow come down over the frozen lake. He said, You know what people don't understand about getting old? They think it makes you need other people to make decisions for you. But what it actually gives you, if you've lived right, is the knowledge of which decisions are yours to make and which people are worth trusting with them. I've thought about that a lot since. Irene would have liked that. She would have written it down somewhere. My daughter-in-law and I have rebuilt something that I'd say is functional, maybe slowly becoming something warmer. Kevin and I talk more now than we did in the year before. All this happened, which is the strange thing, the thing I didn't expect. Getting through that conversation in November opened something that had been closed for a long time. Last March, he drove up on a Saturday, and we replaced the back fence together. Just the two of us, with tools and lumber and a cooler of cold drinks. We didn't talk about any of it. We just worked. At the end of the day, we stood and looked at the fence, and it was good, solid work, and we both knew it, and that was enough. My grandchildren come up most school holidays. My granddaughter has decided the geese on the lake are all hers personally and has named several of them. My grandson is learning to fish. I'm teaching him the same way my own father taught me, with patience and silence, and the understanding that the point was never really the fish. The house is still mine. Everything I worked for is still mine. The documents Diane holds on file are fair and considered and written to protect the person I am, not to make things convenient for someone else. Gord comes up the last weekend of every month. Sometimes we just sit and watch the lake. He says I make the best coffee in Frontenac County. I've never disagreed. I think about Irene every day. I still talk to her sometimes, out loud when I'm alone on the back deck in the evening. I tell her about the kids. I tell her about Gord. I tell her about the fence. I told her about all of this too, eventually. Sitting outside on a cold night in December, the stars out, the lake frozen and still. You handled it, I could almost hear her say. I did, not perfectly, but honestly, that's all I ever tried to do.